Hi, this is Dick DeAngelis, and welcome to another episode of Inside Fairfield's History. This interview is with Anton Till, the most prolific of the field archaeologists in Jefferson County history. Anton worked alongside the people at Parsons College for a while. He worked very closely with our state archaeologist office and is still highly respected. I came across Anton living in Atomo, Iowa, and asked him if he would come and do an interview with us. This is the first one of those interviews we did at Walnut Creek, and it ended up being a very important part of our first film, Life Before Fairfield.
I've been involved in archaeological research in the state for probably over 40 years, on or off. I've held different positions and mostly involved in site survey, essentially going out and looking for archaeological sites, looking for evidence on the landscape where people previously lived. And over those years, I've learned quite a few interesting things about horticulture and more in particular about Native Americans in Iowa. We're sitting here, for example, filming on Walnut Creek, and it's one of the major streams, streams on the Skunk River Basin. And what's remarkable about this stream, along with many others in this area, is this is where there were avenues where people traveled. The rivers were our highways, like our highways today. And people traveled in, and they found niches, environmental areas, all along these streams, and that's where they settled. They had their camps. And over 10,000 years of prehistory, we can find here, documented, mainly from artifacts that have been found by various collectors and archaeologists alike. But this particular area, northeast corner of Jefferson County, is really a unique area. In this part of the county, we have evidence of what we call Paleo-Indian. These are the first Native Americans who ventured into North America. They were big game hunters. At that time when they lived in Iowa, there was a ice sheet that was covering central part of Iowa that extended all the way down to the city of Des Moines. This ice sheet was, just imagine, a hunk of ice that's a mile high. And down below it were vast white pine and spruce forests. And the native people at that time, who eventually came in from the northern area, from Alaska, from the land bridge in Alaska into North America, came into the interior of North America. And in Iowa, they were living probably below the ice sheets, where the animals, large megafauna, we call them, the large mammals like mastodons and mammoths, and were living in at the time, and they would hunt them. There were probably small groups, extended families. We know they existed, but they have very specific projectile points that they made. One is a Clovis point, and Clovis points are unique because they have flutes driven off them on the bottom for attachment to shafts, and they were probably used in conjunction with the atlatl, which is a spear thrower. But these people, we don't know too much about them, other than they were here. We can speculate about them. But then things changed dramatically. The climate started to become milder. and the summers became longer.
When was this?
This was in the process around 10,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago. Things were changing in Iowa, and the climate became more mild. As a result, these great ice sheets that were in the northern part of Iowa began to melt. It's hard to understand. We really don't have a good grasp on how long it took for the ice to melt. But there's evidence, if you look at the landforms that were formed, the gouging effects that we find in the river valleys, the large embankments, what we call now bluffs that overlook the valley, that there was a period of time that was far tranquil than we find with this creek right now. There were just torrents of water, huge expanses of floods extending down into the river valleys. The Moines River, for example, is one of the major areas draining what we call the Des Moines Lobe. The Lobe, if you look on a satellite map even today, you can actually see a change in the color in the soil. And it looks like a lobate extension of different soil. Well, that's where the glacier was. And as it melted, these torrents of water, these floodwaters, would go down the river, gouging away the river. The Mississippi was draining huge areas, and the Missouri as well, of the northern areas where the great glaciers was moving. It's called a Wisconsin age in geological terms. And you'll note that in some of the literature and stuff as you read it. It's late Pleistocene is what it is really, and it's called the Wisconsin stage, glacial stage. That was probably put a lot of stress on people, these Paleo-Indians, and their whole world was changing. I mean, dramatically. The landscapes were changing. There were probably areas they could not travel. They were hunting and gathering more, or getting into a hunting and gathering stage, but they were still following the large game. But there is some evidence that because of these floods in the river valleys, a lot of these people came probably isolated in between river valleys. They couldn't cross the Mississippi River because there's no way you could cross it. Even the Des Moines River may have been a huge border fence to prevent them from migrating from one area to the next. So at that stage, the climate gradually warmed, the glaciers left, the ice melted, the levels of the water retreated, and they became more stable as far as the landscape's concerned. Also, you'll find vegetation changes occurring all over Iowa, and at that stage, people, they survived. They survived the climatic times of the glacial period, and now they became more resilient in a way because they become adaptive. They're becoming more and more adaptive to the changes in the climate. And so you find the Paleo-Indian people coming into the stage what we call the Archaic. The Archaic started probably 9,000 years ago, and it extended up to about 3,000 to still in some areas 2,500 BC in that area. And what it was is a unique area, time. Climate became more easy to live in. I mean, their environments became more stable. You've seen abundance of game. Different types of tree species started to grow. There was a lot more food and resources for them. And they were hunting, gathering. They were moving around, like on this creek. They would come up these creeks, often on a seasonal basis. They would find locations where held the most resources were there, like food and water and so forth. One of the most important thing you'll find is you'll see that their entire material culture expands. Back in the days of being a paleo hunter, you probably didn't have a lot. You had atlatls, you had atlatl spears, you probably had skin huts, things that were very portable that you can travel with a family. Similar to, like the idea of the teepee, where Plains Indians could move quickly, in a day they're gone. Well, the archaic stage is noted for change. That's essentially what it is, an adaptation. People began to expand their culture. What I'm saying, expand their culture, it's mainly military culture. You'll find the use of more and more different types of stone tools. They were living more in woodland environments now. They kind of settled in areas, like I said, where the resources were most abundant. And that includes wood, trees, they had shelter in the wintertime, food, resources from trees like walnuts and so forth, and even like acorns. Acorns was a very important food to natives. But you'll find in their toolkit, archaeologists call it a toolkit, essentially you'll find groundstone axes now. These are cobbles that people selected. They use sand and an abrasion method with another stone to shape them into axes or mauls and so forth. And the reason for that is because now they're woodworking. You're using trees very importantly in their culture to extract, for example, American linden tree, basswood. If you strip the bark off and you hit it on the inside of the bark, with a maul or a handheld cobble or something, you soften up the inner fibers. Those inner fibers can be removed, and they're real long and they're extremely strong. And you can weave them into ropes, you can make fishing twine, you can make clothing out of them. So there was a very important aspect of their activities was just processing tree bark. But you also could make dugout canoes. You can use the fire burning method, burn a tree down. If you ever use the stone axe, it doesn't work too well at chopping a tree down. But if you build a large fire at the base of a tree, and as the tree carbonizes the wood, it softens, and you can hit it with the axe and knock off the burned wood. And you continue that process till it falls over. And then you begin the process of building fires on top of the log or on the side of the log to cut it in length. And in a number of weeks, they could hollow out this log by using controlled burning and using the stone axes. So that's something they never did during the Paleo-Indian days. They may have had canoes, some sort of skin boats. Like later Plains Indians, they had a bull boat, which is a willow frame, and a bison hide was stretched over it. And it was like a little round bowl where you could, flop around in the water. But it was allowed you to cross streams. And if you had a bunch of them, you can haul a lot of material from one place to another. But the Archaic, again, changed everything. People all across North America found niches. In the Southwest, the Archaic people found areas in the desert Southwest. They lived in caves. They lived in little areas where there was water. Waterfowl came in. They made shoes, sandals out of reeds, and duck decoys out of reeds. We found all these, 7,000 to 8,000 years old that were in caves, dry caves. In the maritime areas, along the coastal areas, the Archaic people developed a whole new culture. It was hunting large sea mammals and fishing and that sort of thing. And in Iowa, It was the interior of North America, and Iowa was right there in the center. Their culture developed around the prairie and the eastern woodlands. We're right in this area where the eastern woodlands, they're like fingers extending into the prairie. And in Iowa, that's where these people were. And it really didn't change that much till when the Europeans started coming in, because when the Europeans came in, they found a similar type of mosaic on the landscape, vegetative mosaic. Now, during the Archaic period, there was a lot of inventions. They were using the atlatl. You'll find a great expanse of type of tools being used. I'll give you an example of a stone tool. This is a large, like, hand axe, but archaeology would probably classify it as a preform. It's bifacial in nature. Natives would produce a bifacial tool, which is essentially a rock. This happens to be chert, which is a fine crystal rock that's flakeable. And they reduce it into a form like this by taking flakes off both sides of it. And that's what we call bifacial tool. Now, the archaic people would use these tools for chopping, cutting, and digging roots and sort of things. There was a lot of different types of tubers and like a wild bear potatoes and things that are accessible by tools like this. This particular piece is not really diagnostic in terms of when it was found, because forms like this started in the Archaic and they followed through all the way up to historic times. So a lot of the tools were just like our wrench, you know. You go back in history and collect wrenches and you'll find early wrenches. And they have a function, like grabbing something and you twist it. But you can go to the hardware store at Walmart and find a wrench there, and it still does the same function. It's just different than it used to be. So essentially, the functions of these tools are usually multifunctional. You can use them for cutting and so forth. But the important part of it is that you'll find this development occurring during the Archaic, because they were involved in so much different kinds of work. For example, they didn't have pottery. Well, one thing they did have was steatite. People had found soapstone in different locations, and they would mine it. And soapstone was neat because, first of all, it would hold heat. Second of it was real soft, and with a proper tool and you know, a little elbow grease, you can hollow it out into a bowl or a pot. The other important thing is that was a way to hold food. It's a way to cook food. And in combination, what we call stone boiling, became very, very important in the Archaic stage. In fact, many of our Archaic sites that are predominantly Archaic, you find huge quantities of what we call firecrack rock. Those are rocks that were cobbles. People would gather cobbles like out of Walnut Creek here, bring them up into where their campsite is. Now, not far from here is a large bluff, and there you can find just tons of firecrack rock all over the field. And what they were doing there is stone boiling. They would take water, put it in their steatite bowl, heat up the rocks in a fire, take the rocks and dip them into the water. Well, if you're boiling eggs, for example, I just got a whole bunch of goose eggs, and I'm going to boil goose eggs, for example. You can put the eggs in there and put the hot rocks in, and the water will start getting hot. And then you take the rocks out, pick up more hot rocks out of the fire, and continue that process. Eventually, the water will reach a temperature where hot rocks, once they're introduced, keep the water boiling for a long period of time. I've done this on my own, experimentally, and it's almost like magic, you know. And I can see some people probably back then, how that worked, hard to kind of think about it, why was this happening like that? But it is amazing how it's done. But it was a way that people cook food. They could cook food on the way. They can carry these vessels with them. But more importantly, they also developed ways to use leather. For example, stomachs from bison and animals could be used for the same purpose, for carrying water, just like bladders are being used, animal parts, bladders and stomachs. And you could use a stomach of a bison and hang it under a tripod, fill it with water, and use the same old hot rock tray. And you'd cook a stew. You can have all your wild onions and whatever you could get in there, and plus some couple of squirrels floating around in there, and you could have a nice meal. But again, the archaic, as we have studied it and what we know of it, it was a time of change. People became sedentary in a way. They were still hunting and gathering for a long time. But in some areas, they became more permanent. And they would still have what we call a seasonal round. That probably was developed during the Archaic. A seasonal round is where people will travel during seasons. Wintertime is a time where large groups would have a very difficult time of surviving. Say you had 5 or 6 nuclear families or extended families that would come together in warm season. There they could hunt together, and you would need more hands and so forth in collecting fish, nuts and so forth, and processing all the things you need to survive in the winter. But as the winter approached, then it was a time to split. And people, for example, maybe one nuclear family, would have a site up a stream like Walnut, way miles and miles from the Skunk River Valley. And there in the winter, they would move and migrate to that particular area and then occupy that site, hunker in for the winter. And the other parts of the group would do the same in different drainages. This is probably one of the ways why reasons archaeologists, when they're doing their research, find so many different sites. There's thousands of sites on the landscape. In this area here, probably every elevated area, you'll find evidence of occupation. And that, if you extend that over the entire county, you're dealing with thousands and thousands of occupations. But you're also dealing with thousands and thousands of years, and these people migrating about, moving about during the seasonal round. Now, during the Archaic, the weather, climate, let's say more climate, was more to their advantage. I mean, it was there were periods of time where things got drier, and there were times when things were really wet. And it really affected them probably, and they had to migrate in different areas and find new niches to survive in. But things really became probably more conducive to settlement in the latter part of the Archaic period, when you're getting to about 3,000 years ago. And then things also changed. People, for the first time, started to use pottery. The idea of pottery, we believe, came from the southeast part of the United States and moved into the interior. But people depended now on pottery. And the reason why they depended on it, because they started horticulture. It was beginning, the weather changed to the point where you can grow crops. There were domestication of grasses that all of a sudden, a particular grass started growing kernels, and it was corn. And a lot of the early types of corn, and the first evidence of it, is showing up in South America. And it may have been a case where from South America went up to Mesoamerica and into North America. And it was brought by groups or traded or whatever. But the important part is the weather allowed, the climate allowed for the domestication of crops, having little gardens, beans and squash. People could produce things. And when people produce food, especially grain crops or anything like, they need storage. Now this climate is still a wet climate. It's a moist climate in the winter and so forth. It's not like the Southwest where you can store crops in baskets. You can store your entire corn crop in a basket. You can have pottery too and store it in there, and it's not going to deteriorate. But here, pottery became more and more important for storage of foods during that time, during the winter time. Probably, I would say 80% of the time, people living in that period spent their time preparing for winter. If you go to Alaska, you'll see the same thing. Folks really try to do as much as they can during the warm weather, but one really important part is gathering food, gathering resources for the winter. Even though we live in a modern world, they still rely on that food. As the climate became more milder, people again were producing more food. They could essentially become more permanent. Developing pottery, and we call that whole group, a culture changed again. Archaeologists call it the woodland period. And this is an interesting period. It's a period where we find the development of really more complex societies. We find, for example, people building fortifications, large mound groups. We find the woodland people building mortuary sites that look like marching bears on early part of the woodland period. And that period in woodland is probably the most expansive in Jefferson County. For example, around Fairfield, Iowa, you can walk within a half mile and find evidence of woodland occupation. You can go just east to the nearest creek and walk to uplands and you'll find woodland pottery. Cedar Creek, which goes right through south of Fairfield, was another very important thoroughfare for the woodland people. They went all the way up through around Libertyville. They had large woodland sites there. And the woodland period extended probably to about 1000 AD. And then we go into what we call a late woodland period, where people get into living in more large groups. And we get into the late prehistoric period, which is late woodland and Mississippian. And here we find groups of people actually coming from Mesoamerica, at least ideas flowing from Mesoamerica up the Mississippi River, and people establishing large village sites, actually small cities on the Mississippi, for example. Now, important thing, I guess, you can study all these different cultures. And you can say, well, the natives Native Americans were extremely adapted, could adapt to all different changes. And they were. But humans are that way too. You're trying to survive. You're trying to keep your family safe and that sort of thing. And that security is very important. And you learn the hard way how to do that. Now, when the first settlers moved in, the Europeans started coming to Jefferson County, for example. What did they look for? Did they want to see their house on the prairie? or did they want to build a cabin in the woods? Well, the answer is they built the cabin in the woods. They had to do the same things as people 2,000 to 3,000 years ago who lived in Iowa. They had to adapt the same way. They wanted trees. Why did they want trees? They want big trees. And the big trees were along the river valleys. And they were in the little streams like Walnut Creek here. Why is it called Walnut? Because there were huge walnut trees here. These people cut the trees down, hewed them out, made log cabins. Not far from here, about a half mile, is a log cabin made probably in the 1830s or 40s. And it's still there, believe it or not. But it's a good example of where people live. They live right along these areas, right along the creeks, not far from the rivers. And most of the earliest towns that were formed were during that period, from the 1840s and 1850s, were along the river, like the Moines River, for example. So people when they first came in as settlers, they didn't go to the prairie. You ever been on the prairie in the winter, you wonder why. You know, the people were forced out in the prairies, went out, forced out, but they went out on their own to find new lives out there, farms and such, sort of established farms. They had to have twist grass. They had nothing to burn in their fireplace. And for all the summer months, you were cutting grass, twisting grass into knots, and hoarding them and burning them for the winter. Now that's a lot of work. Out here you could pick up dead trees and harvest them and cut them up and use them for firewood. Now this is the area where all the game was. Most of the game you find in Iowa, not on the prairie. Most of the game was along the peripheral areas where the prairie meets the forest. That's where the big game, namely bison. Bison were here on an early stage in Jefferson County. There were reports of bison by Lockridge. There were elk in Iowa. There were black bear in Iowa. A lot of different species of game that was available to the first settlers. That soon changed, though, because as the early settlers moved in, they literally cut everything. What real important thing that like late prehistoric people probably were involved in, and especially historic groups, historic Native Americans, was making maple sugar. Southern Iowa and southeast Iowa was renowned for their sugar camps. There were large stands of hard maple on Walnut Creek, all the way down to where Donaldson is, north of Burlington, clear over by Sheraton. And the Meskwaki people, and by the turn of the century, were still occupying these sites early in the spring. And this idea of harvesting sap from trees probably goes back who knows how many years. And maybe the reason why we find so much firecrack rock on these sites, where these stone boiling weren't cooking food all the time, but they were cooking sap. They were making large dugout-like canoe containers they could fill with tree sap from maple trees, and then using the hard firecrack rock or the cobbles, heated up cobbles, dipping them in them to burn away and boil away the sap till you get the sugar. And why would that be important? Because I would think in the wintertime is when you really need some energy. And they would cake this stuff, they would harvest it, and it was very important food for them for survival. Later on, it was probably more traditional things they were doing. It was part of their tradition. But I think it was something that was started much, much earlier. And soon a lot of these things changed as the people in Jefferson County started to settle. They developed as much area as they could. Every knob, little area, the farms were small because they were, in within these small river valleys and small drainage ways. But later on, someone invented a plow. Someone invented a way to drain the prairies. A lot of parts of Jefferson County were impassable. The prairie wasn't just tall grass, it was marsh, wet, and when it rained, you couldn't even bring a wagon through there. For example, just on the other side, in the Wapello County by Eldon, there was a road they had to build across the prairie. It was made out of logs. And it went from Eldon to Agency. That's the only way they could cross that prairie. So when they invented field tile and way to drain areas, then these areas opened up to farms. And that only happened in the latter part of the 19th century. So technology there actually expanded where people could live and grow crops and sort of things. Many of the people who first ventured into North America were from Asia. And no doubt they brought them with them their beliefs that developed in that environment at that time. And as they lived big game hunting, their religious practices, even their medicines that they developed and stuff, was all involved in that large game hunting kind of lifestyle. As people ventured into the Archaic period, as things changed, people started to live in different environments. And we see all around the world that when you take people up and move them somewhere and they settle in this particular area, they start to develop new ideas, new things. They learn about their environment. For example, you're dealing with medicines and herbs and things that would heal and that sort of thing. Now they have a whole new group of plants out there. They have to go out and learn, probably eat this if it kills you, maybe not, maybe it helps, that sort of thing. So they have to develop over thousands of years new knowledge about their environment. The Archaic was probably also a time where you had more religious type expressions. We do find a lot of carved things. We do find, it's like in Horticulture, you find a lot of carved bone, You find a lot of different objects that are not, they have no function. The non-functional things that we find in our culture, like a cross or a crucifix or something, is, if someone finds it, what does it mean? What function? If we're someone looking at it from 20,000 years from now, what is that? You would try to say, does it have a function? Well, it doesn't have a function. There's so much that we find, archaeologists have found, and that we don't know what the purpose of it. Well, it didn't have a purpose. It probably had related to religious beliefs, something that we can never know, that sort of thing. But certainly throughout North America, the native people that lived here, if you went 100 miles from now, you'll find other people living. And as the natives developed, it seems like they developed in these niches and they all became different. And that's the thing, I guess, the European could not reach in and learn or understand, is that native people were different everywhere. Everywhere you went, there was somebody different. They had their own creation myths. Where do we come from? Well, this group, they came out of a snake in a river, This group had something else. And you don't have to go very far to see that. Their whole religious history, if you speak. Their oral histories and traditions are all different. They're handed down just by speech, and learn their beliefs and that sort of thing. And they were all different. So you find great diversity amongst Native people. There were things that were common that ties them all together. If you find a groundstone axe, for example, like this one I have in my little pocket. This is a three-quarter groove stone axe. But I can find that in Florida. I can find that in Wisconsin. I can find that in Pennsylvania. They all look alike. They may be made out of a different rock that was available to them. But again, it's kind of a universal thing, It's got a groove around it. You can put a handle and haft to it. And you can use it for chopping wood and so forth, or chasing after your neighbor, or whatever. But again, that shows their unity based on how they adapt it. It's just. But when it comes to religion, when it comes to their beliefs, then it becomes more mystical in a lot of ways. Hard to determine those things. All my 40 some odd years, I've walked archaeological sites. I've collected innumerable examples of artifacts, arrowheads and spear points and axes and pottery. All of which was done as representing the state of Iowa, and all those things eventually went into the archives of the University of Iowa. I never was involved in just collecting for myself. Now, many people do, and it's a fun hobby. Many of the sites that we walk on are cultivated. They've been cultivated for years and years, which means the area of plowing has been all disturbed. And you can walk out and find things and still find an arrowhead or two. Nothing like it used to be when the land was first tilled. Because when it was first tilled, the amount of artifacts that were laying on the soil in those fields were just incredible, what was found. Thousands of axes and projectile points, beautiful spearheads. All through Iowa, some of the earliest and most impressive collections represent that time when the land was just first tilled. When I was doing archaeology, which was in the 60s and late 60s, 70s, and 80s, and into the 90s. Well, not so much the 90s, but that period, a lot of the areas around here, the cultivated areas, were plowed. And plowing was great for finding artifacts, but bad for soil erosion. Now we have more sustainable agriculture. We're using chisel plows and so forth, and we leave a lot of refuse, corn stalks, bean stubble, things like that in the field. And you can't find as much. People are still out there looking, though. The thing that everybody has to remember is the artifacts are representing a people that once lived right in your backyard sometimes, right on the same farm you live. And you're dealing with thousands of years. And Americans have always had this, I don't know, they never really focused on that, not like a European does. A European more focuses on knowing that the value of their culture that goes back. Maybe it's because it's not European culture. In Mexico, for example, the Mexican government and the archaeological concerns in Mexico are very, very involved in promoting Mexican culture, their prehistory, as well as all the way down to Mayan cultures in the Yucatan. But here we need to learn. We need to learn about who lived here before. We cannot get ahead of ourselves. We have to learn from the past. There's people who lived here that had learned how to use the land productively. Yes, it's true that native people, later on when they became overpopulated in large villages, had a drastic impact on the environment, and they did. They could grow crops. They could stay in that village. And the problem was they consumed everything. There was back in the 1830s, mid-1830s, somebody went up on a little riverboat on the Des Moines River, and when they approached Bentonsport and Bonaparte, well, all they could see for miles were dead elm trees. And they thought they were skeletons. They looked like skeletons, dead trees for miles. Why they were dead? Because all the bark from the elms had been stripped from the top all the way down and used for Indian lodges. Very practical way to cover a wigwam. And that's because of large villages and large populations. Many had 500, 600, 700 people living in those villages. And I used to do a lot of environmental things and educational presentations to school kids. And one thing I always stressed to them was that just imagine your family living out somewhere out in a park. Go to Jefferson County Park, and you're the only family living there. And when you get there, you say, oh, look, there's a rabbit. Oh, there's a squirrel. Now imagine you're going to have 4 months of miserable cold weather. And the weather years back was really intense. You got snows, 3-4 feet snows. You didn't travel. You didn't go very far. You were stuck there. How long can your family survive in Jefferson County Park? By living on your resources within a day's walk. And then you start realizing that in 1 week, you'd have killed all the rabbits, you've killed all the squirrels. Probably within a month, you've killed all the deer. Now you're looking for turtles that are hibernating in the streams. Pretty soon you're looking for frogs that may be in the mud. And eventually, by mid-winter, you're eating grass and roots and things of that nature, just to survive. That's one family. So you can see what it would do if you had 500 or 600 people living in early Iowa like that. It takes a lot of resources. So native people moved. They weren't stupid. They were very, very practical people. And we learn a lot about them. They move from one area to the next. That's the idea of sustainable. You farm a farm. You don't farm it to death. You shut it down. Go to the next piece of land and farm it. Let it recover. And that's what they did. Very simple thing. Nothing new. But that's some of the lessons we can learn from Native Americans. And either their traditions, their belief systems, we can learn a lot. The way they look at the world, how they view things, even their politics today, why they think the way they do. There's a reason for that. And that's ingrained in centuries of history for those people. So all I can say is it's something that most people should learn. Have at least a basic understanding of who was here before us. And maybe we can glean a little bit of information that will help us survive in the future.